Eddie Van Halen, the legendary guitarist of Van Halen, passed away in 2020, leaving behind not only his music but also his home in the Coldwater Canyon area of Beverly Hills. His house, a sprawling and private estate tucked into the Hollywood Hills, became a subject of fascination for fans and neighbors alike after his death. Not long after his passing, the property was sold to a young couple from San Francisco, Daniel and Rebecca Moore. Daniel, a tech entrepreneur, and Rebecca, a freelance photographer, had been looking for a home in Los Angeles that carried history and character. They knew it had once belonged to Eddie, but they brushed off any talk of lingering energy or the stories circulating in the neighborhood about odd lights and noises coming from the house in the years after his death. For them, it was a dream, a gated mansion with sweeping views of Los Angeles, hidden from the world by tall trees and winding roads. Rebecca especially loved the recording studio space Eddie had built, a part of the house that still smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and guitar strings. From the beginning, though, the Moores couldn't shake a strange feeling in the house. The first night, Rebecca said she heard faint guitar notes drifting down the hallway, even though no instruments were in the home yet. Daniel thought it was just her imagination, but the sound returned on several nights, low, distorted riffs, as if coming from another room. Neighbors would casually warn them that house always had a strange energy, even when Eddie was alive. Some said he rarely left the studio, playing into the early morning hours, and others whispered that his spirit had never really left the property. At times, the Moores felt watched. Rebecca would be editing photos in the studio and notice the faint reflection of someone standing behind her in the glass, only to turn and find the room empty. Daniel, usually a skeptic, admitted that the air in the house sometimes carried the sharp scent of cigarettes, though neither of them smoked. The couple grew divided over it. Rebecca felt a fascination, as though Eddie's spirit was tied to his music, still alive in the walls. Daniel, however, started to dread the nights. He swore he heard faint footsteps across the hardwood floors when he was alone, and sometimes the amps in the studio would crackle to life on their own. Whether it was the power of suggestion or something real, the Moores could not deny that Eddie Van Halen's presence still lingered in the house, a reminder that legends leave more behind than just their art. The longer the Moores lived in Eddie Van Halen's former home, the more the house seemed to change around them. What had first felt like a dream retreat slowly became an environment charged with tension, as if the walls themselves carried a restless pulse. During the day, the estate was stunning, the sun glinting off the pool, the long driveway lined with shadowy eucalyptus trees, and the views of Los Angeles stretching endlessly below. But once night fell, the property seemed to transform. The silence of the canyon pressed in, broken only by faint creaks, shifting air, and, at times, the subtle echo of guitar notes that neither Daniel nor Rebecca could explain. Rebecca began to spend more time in Eddie's recording studio, drawn to it almost compulsively. The room had been left nearly intact when the house changed ownership. The soundproofed walls, padded and slightly yellowed with age, still bore faint marks where amps and equipment had once stood. In the corner sat an old, empty guitar case left behind, its latches rusted, as though it hadn't been touched in years. She found the space strangely inspiring. Sitting on the worn leather couch, she often felt as if someone was just out of view, encouraging her, whispering a rhythm only she could hear. Daniel, however, felt the opposite. He avoided the studio. He claimed that every time he walked past it, he caught a faint vibration under his feet, like the hum of an amplifier switched on though no power flowed through the room. At night, when Rebecca stayed up late editing photos in the studio, he would lie awake in their bedroom, the low rumble of distorted strings carrying faintly through the floorboards. Sometimes it built into a crescendo, a fast riff that ended in a sharp screech only to vanish the moment he got up to check. The couple started to notice other things too. Cigarette smoke would appear in sudden bursts, lingering in the air before dissipating. More than once, Rebecca swore she saw a faint glow in the studio window as she walked outside at dusk, even though she knew no light had been left on. Daniel noticed it too, a warm, golden shimmer, like the glow of a lamp, flickering as though someone was pacing inside. Neighbors spoke of Eddie's intensity when he was alive. They said he could spend days locked in that studio, barely eating, consumed by music until his fingers bled. Some mentioned how the canyon seemed quieter after his death, as if it had lost a sound that had always belonged to it. Now that silence had returned, except inside the house it was broken by echoes that didn't belong to the living. Rebecca grew increasingly attached to the idea that Eddie was still present. She began leaving her camera set up on a tripod in the studio, trying to capture what she felt. When she reviewed her photos, strange blurs sometimes appeared in the frames. A faint shape leaning in the corner, a streak of light bending unnaturally across the room, or the outline of what looked like hands on the glass windowpane. She never told Daniel how much these images unsettled her, instead insisting it was artistic imperfection. But deep down, she knew she was documenting something beyond her control. Daniel's unease sharpened into something close to fear. He confessed one night that as he closed his laptop in the office, he heard a voice faintly muttering just behind him. He turned quickly, but the chair in the corner was empty, the air stale and still. The only thing he could smell was smoke, thick and acrid, as though someone had just put out a cigarette seconds before. The Moores stopped inviting friends over. It was too difficult to explain why the air sometimes shifted so suddenly, why their guests would grow uncomfortable, claiming they felt like someone was staring at them from the hallway. Despite everything, neither Daniel nor Rebecca felt ready to leave. The house had an undeniable hold over them. For Rebecca, it was almost creative fuel, a connection to something larger, as if Eddie's spirit guided her hands when she worked. For Daniel, it was a heavy weight, something oppressive that pressed down harder with each passing week. And yet, every evening as the city lights flickered below and the canyon winds rattled the trees, the house seemed to awaken once more, humming faintly with life that should not have remained. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The nights inside Eddie Van Halen's old estate grew longer for Daniel and Rebecca. The house, once full of promise, now seemed to bend time itself. Hours stretched in strange ways, as if the clocks ran slower within its walls. The couple began to lose track of when the evenings truly ended and mornings began, and the sound of faint guitar strings often carried through that uncertainty like a thread, pulling them deeper into the house's unseen rhythm. Rebecca, more than ever, was drawn to the studio. She began leaving her laptop open on the desk inside, working late into the night under the dim glow of the overhead lamp. She told herself it was the energy of the space that helped her focus, but she could not deny the strange sensations that came with it. Often, when she typed, she felt as though someone's presence loomed just behind her shoulder, not threatening, not entirely comforting either, but insistent. The faint reflection in the window glass sometimes betrayed more than her own figure, the hint of another silhouette, broad-shouldered, leaning as if watching her carefully. When she would turn, there was nothing but the padded walls and the stale smell of cigarettes lingering in the air. Daniel, meanwhile, had begun avoiding the lower level of the house altogether. Something about the studio unsettled him deeply. He claimed the entire wing carried a charge, a subtle vibration that seemed to crawl up his spine whenever he walked too close. Even in the kitchen, just above the studio, he swore the floorboards trembled faintly at night, like the thrum of a bass turned too low to be heard but strong enough to be felt. He slept less and less, the insomnia sharpening his features. He grew pale, with dark shadows under his eyes, and he told Rebecca in hushed tones that the house wanted something from them, though he couldn't say what. Small details began to accumulate, each one harder to ignore than the last. Doors that they had left closed would be found open in the morning. The old guitar case in the corner of the studio, once gathering dust, seemed to shift positions slightly from day to day, angled differently as though someone had nudged it with their foot. The faint metallic click of its latches would sometimes echo in the silence, though neither of them dared open it. Rebecca began to hear music in her dreams. Entire riffs, sharp and complex, would roll through her sleep like thunder. She would wake with her heart racing, convinced that the sound had come from inside the house rather than her mind. More disturbing were the moments between waking and dreaming when she would see, just for a heartbeat, a man sitting on the couch in the studio, his head bent low, his fingers moving across an invisible guitar. She never spoke of this to Daniel, afraid it would push him further into the fear that already gnawed at him. The neighbors, those who had lived in the canyon long enough, seemed to know more than they admitted. One elderly man who walked his dog near the property stopped Daniel one afternoon and asked gently, "You hearing it yet?" When Daniel tried to press him, the man only smiled sadly and said, "Nobody moves into that house without hearing it. Some folks leave sooner than others." Even the house itself showed signs of strain. The lights in the studio wing flickered more often, buzzing faintly as if struggling against some invisible interference. The air vents carried whispers of smoke, sometimes accompanied by a faint cough, deep and raspy, drifting into the halls. And every so often, the amps, though unplugged and untouched, would emit a low static hum, a pulse that seemed alive. Daniel tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was faulty wiring, leftover odors clinging to the vents, the tricks of an old house shifting. But his explanations rang hollow even to himself. When he stood in the darkened hallway at night, watching the golden shimmer glow faintly behind the closed studio door, he felt sure that someone was inside, someone who had never left. Rebecca, on the other hand, began to feel as though she was meant to be there. The photographs she took inside the studio became more distorted, more surreal. Light streaks bent unnaturally. Shapes that resembled hands or outlines appeared where there should have been nothing. She called it art. But inside, she felt the pull growing stronger, a connection she could not resist. Even if it was leading her somewhere she didn't fully understand. The house was no longer just a home. It was alive, breathing with echoes of a man who had poured his entire soul into its walls. And with each passing night, those echoes seemed to grow louder, as if the house was waiting for the moment when the Moores could no longer separate their lives from his lingering presence. The canyon was always quiet at night, but inside Eddie Van Halen's former home, the quiet felt unnatural, like the pause before a string snapped. Daniel and Rebecca had begun to adjust their lives around the house's moods. They didn't talk about it openly, not anymore. Instead, they moved carefully through the evenings as if they were guests, not owners, afraid to disturb whatever presence had taken root there. Rebecca spent more and more time in the studio, the heart of the house's strange pulse. She rearranged her schedule so she could sit there long after midnight, editing photographs or simply listening to the silence. The silence itself was never empty. It carried with it faint shifts, the scrape of something against the wall, the soft thud of movement in the padded corners. She told herself it was memory, the echo of a man who had once lived through his guitar, but sometimes her heart raced with the thought that it was more than memory. On certain nights she swore she could hear actual music. Not the faint strum Daniel sometimes complained about, but entire passages. Riffs that rose from nowhere, bending into melodies she didn't recognize yet felt certain she had heard before. The sound never seemed to come from one place. It floated, circling her like smoke. She once tried to record it on her phone, but when she played the file back later, all she heard was static and what sounded like the sharp intake of breath, as though someone had been standing too close to the microphone. Daniel, meanwhile, began retreating from the house. He took longer trips into the city, preferring the noise of traffic to the oppressive stillness at home. When he did stay, he lingered upstairs, avoiding the lower level where the studio sat. Yet even there, the house found him. Lying in bed, he often smelled cigarettes burning, so sharp and acrid that his eyes watered. Other times, the floor beneath the bed would vibrate faintly, a steady thrum like a low note held too long. He would sit up, listening, and realize the sound was coming from beneath them, the studio directly below. He tried to explain it away, old wiring, bad insulation, nerves, but every attempt at reason seemed thinner than the last. The truth was harder to ignore. When he was alone, he felt watched, not in the vague way people sometimes describe, but directly, intensely, as though someone's eyes followed him from doorway to doorway. He had caught himself turning sharply more than once, convinced he'd seen a figure move past the edge of his vision. Each time the hallway was empty, yet the feeling clung to him, heavy and undeniable. One evening, after weeks of growing tension, Daniel found Rebecca sitting on the floor of the studio. She had set up her camera on a tripod, aimed not at herself but at the far wall. The flash had gone off repeatedly, and when Daniel stepped into the doorway, he saw dozens of photographs scattered around her. In nearly every frame, faint distortions bled into the image, long streaks of light, blurred shadows in the shape of a man leaning forward, sometimes so detailed it looked like hands hovering above strings. Rebecca's eyes were wide and distant when she looked up at him. "He's here," she said softly, not as a question, but a fact. Daniel gathered the photos, his hands trembling as he flipped through them. Each shot seemed worse than the last, as though the figure grew bolder with every flash. In one, just behind Rebecca's shoulder, the blurred outline of a man's face appeared, tilted downward in concentration. Daniel dropped the photograph back onto the floor as a sick heaviness filled his stomach. That night, the air in the house seemed thicker than usual, the silence broken by faint electrical pops and crackles, like amps warming up after years of rest. The lights flickered, buzzing faintly, and from somewhere below, a single sharp chord ripped through the air. It was brief, just one note, but it carried with it such weight that both Daniel and Rebecca froze where they stood, listening. The sound hung in the air long after it ended, vibrating through the walls until it finally faded into nothing. From then on, the house seemed different. The shadows stretched longer in the hallways, lingering even after the lamps were switched on. Doors didn't just open by themselves, they swung slowly, deliberately, as though pushed by unseen hands. The old guitar case in the studio no longer sat quietly in its corner. They often found it angled differently, its lid tilted open a fraction, though neither of them dared look inside. The canyon winds howled more often around the property, rattling the glass windows until they shivered. But inside, the true unease was not the wind, nor the silence, it was the sense of being accompanied at every moment. Whether in the kitchen, the bedroom, or the studio, there was always something there. Breathing, waiting, refusing to leave. And with every passing night, the house pulled them deeper, as if it had chosen them to carry on a song that had never ended. The breaking point came on a night when the city below lay hidden beneath a haze of fog, the kind that rolled in heavy over the canyon and clung to the windows like a veil. Daniel had been restless all evening, pacing from room to room, while Rebecca had once again retreated into the studio with her camera. He couldn't stand it anymore, the way she seemed entranced, almost claimed, by that room. The way she spoke of Eddie as though he were still alive, as though his spirit were a guest she was eager to host. Near midnight, Daniel descended the stairs, determined to bring her out. The air grew colder as he approached the studio door. The faint hum was there again, vibrating through the floorboards, joined by a smell so strong and acrid it made his throat burn. Cigarette smoke mixed with something metallic, like heated strings. When he pushed the door open, he froze. Rebecca sat cross-legged on the floor, her camera in her lap, surrounded by dozens of fresh prints. The photographs scattered around her glowed faintly under the dim lamp, each image worse than the last. A shadow growing clearer, bolder, no longer blurred but almost solid. In one frame, a pair of hands rested on the neck of an unseen guitar. In another, a figure leaned forward, his face obscured, but the long hair and hunched posture were unmistakable. The amps in the room, unplugged, covered in dust, suddenly crackled to life. A low rumble filled the studio, the sound of feedback swelling until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. Daniel stumbled backward, his heart racing, while Rebecca stared straight ahead, her expression calm, almost serene. Then, the guitar case in the corner snapped open with a sharp metallic clatter. The lid flung wide, though no one touched it. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then came the sound. A single, piercing chord, rich and distorted, ringing out as if strummed by invisible hands. It was so loud the glass in the window rattled, sending fine cracks through its surface. Daniel shouted for Rebecca, but she did not move. She was staring into the far corner, her lips parted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. Slowly, her eyes filled with tears. "He doesn't want to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling but not afraid. This was his world. It still is. The amps roared again, a riff spilling out into the room fast, furious, unmistakably alive. The padded walls shook, The lamp above them flickered wildly, plunging the studio in and out of darkness, each flash revealing a little more of the figure that was taking shape. Shoulders, hair, the bend of a body leaning into the music. Not flesh, not whole, but undeniable. Daniel felt the air press down on him, heavy and suffocating. His instincts screamed at him to run, but when he tried to grab Rebecca's arm, the heat from her skin seared his palm, forcing him to recoil. She turned her face toward him then, and for a moment her eyes looked wrong, distant, shining, reflecting not the lamp but something else entirely. The music built to a fever pitch, the riffs overlapping, the feedback tearing at the air until it seemed the very house trembled. The floorboards groaned, the walls cracked faintly in protest, yet the sound didn't falter. It was as though the house itself had become the instrument, strings stretched across every beam and nail, resonating with a song that would not die. And then, just as suddenly, silence. The amps died, the lamp steadied, the vibration in the floor ceased. Rebecca collapsed onto the couch, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. Daniel knelt beside her, trembling, not sure if she was awake or unconscious. Around them, the studio looked the same as it always had, the empty guitar case in the corner, the padded walls, the faint smell of smoke fading into the air. Yet Daniel knew nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, Rebecca refused to leave the house. She insisted she felt safe there, watched over, inspired. Her photography took on a new intensity, images warped, full of light trails and ghostly shapes that seemed deliberate, intentional. She claimed the house gave her what she needed, that Eddie's presence was not a curse but a gift. Daniel, however, could not bear it any longer. He found himself unable to sleep, his nerves fraying with every flicker of the lights, every faint hum of static in the walls. He swore he could hear footsteps following him through the halls, the sound of strings bending in the night. One evening, he packed a bag and told Rebecca he was leaving. She didn't stop him. She only looked at him with a sad, faraway expression and whispered, "He chose me, not you." Neighbors say Daniel never came back. The house remains occupied, its windows glowing late into the night. Sometimes, if you pass by on the canyon road, you can hear faint music drifting from the property, fast, distorted riffs that rise and fall, alive in a way no recording could ever capture. And those who know the house's history will tell you the same thing. Eddie Van Halen never left. His music, his spirit, his fire, they are still there, burning in the walls, playing on long after his body is gone. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?